The numbers tell a story that policy papers cannot. In 2025, we are witnessing the most dramatic infrastructure divergence between two superpowers in modern history. China's construction machinery roars across provinces, laying tracks and pouring concrete at a pace that defies Western imagination. Meanwhile, America's infrastructure ambitions stumble through environmental reviews, litigation battles, and bureaucratic labyrinths that stretch projects across decades rather than years. The scale of China's commitment is staggering. By the end of 2024, the Chinese government planned to invest $173 billion in transportation infrastructure projects alone. This figure represents just one slice of a much larger ambition. China's infrastructure construction market reached $815 billion in 2025 and is projected to surge to $1.1 trillion by 2030. These are not merely aspirational numbers on planning documents. They represent bridges rising from valleys, subway tunnels boring beneath megacities, and high-speed rail lines stitching together a continental nation. To understand the magnitude of this divergence, consider the comparative spending between 2013 and 2021. During this period, China poured $679 billion into infrastructure across transportation, energy, and water sectors. The United States, in the same categories and time frame, managed $76 billion. China outspent America by nearly 9-to-1 in the very sectors that define national competitiveness and quality of life. The American response, while substantial on paper, reveals the fundamental difference between an engineering state and a lawyerly society. The Biden administration's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed in late 2021, represented the most significant federal commitment to infrastructure in generations. Over 3 years, the administration announced $568 billion in funding and launched more than 66,000 projects. These projects span bridge repairs, road improvements, broadband expansion, and clean water initiatives. The scope is impressive, touching communities across all 50 states. Yet the execution tells a different story. The American infrastructure machine moves with agonizing slowness, constrained by procedural requirements that prioritize process over outcomes. Every project must navigate a gauntlet of environmental assessments, public comment periods, legal challenges, and regulatory approvals. What should take months stretches into years. What should cost millions balloons into billions. Consider the contrast in subway construction, the arterial system of modern cities. Between 2003 and 2013, Shanghai added as much subway track as the entire existing system in New York City. Shanghai built in 1 decade what New York spent a century accumulating. The Chinese city didn't achieve this through magical engineering breakthroughs. It achieved it through political will, streamlined approval processes, and a government structure that empowers builders rather than obstructors. The engineering state operates on a fundamentally different logic. Chinese leadership, composed overwhelmingly of engineers rather than lawyers, views infrastructure as hydraulic flows to be directed and optimized. They see construction not as a necessary evil requiring endless justification, but as the primary mechanism for economic growth and social legitimacy. When regional economies falter, Beijing's reflexive response is to announce massive infrastructure packages, knowing that planning is already complete and implementation can begin immediately. This philosophy extends beyond rails and roads into the strategic domain of industrial capacity. China pursues what can only be described as completionist manufacturing, determined to produce something in each of the 419 industrial product categories maintained by the United Nations. This stands in stark contrast to the American economic consensus of the 1990s, when an economist could famously quip that computer chips and potato chips made no strategic difference. China understands what America forgot. Industrial capacity is strategic capacity. The ability to rapidly scale production of drones, munitions, or personal protective equipment during a crisis is not merely economic, it is existential. The average Chinese infrastructure investment hovers around 13.5% of GDP, while America manages closer to 3%. This fourfold difference compounds year after year, creating an infrastructure gap that widens like a continental rift. China completes high-speed rail lines at an average cost of $33 million per mile. These lines prove economically viable, connecting cities and enabling commerce at speeds Americans can only experience in airports. Meanwhile, California's high-speed rail project, approved by voters in 2008, has become a monument to American dysfunction. 17 years later, only a small stretch in the Central Valley exists, with the total estimated cost ballooning to $128 billion. The margin of error for estimating when even a partial segment might open, sometime between 2030 and 2033, equals the entire time it took China to complete its Beijing-Shanghai line. That line, of similar length, was finished in 3 years at a cost of $36 billion. This is not a story of Chinese efficiency versus American incompetence. It is a story of two different systems optimized for different outcomes. China's engineering state is optimized for speed and material results. America's lawyerly society is optimized for process and procedural correctness. One system builds at the risk of overreach. The other deliberates at the risk of paralysis. The American system's genius for obstruction manifests in myriad ways. The United States employs 400 lawyers per 100,000 people, 3 times the European average. These legal professionals permeate not just courtrooms but universities, corporations, and government agencies. They bring with them an inherent bias toward caution, toward protecting against potential harms rather than seizing potential opportunities. Every proposed project faces the prospect of litigation from motivated parties who can afford superstar lawyers to delay or derail construction. The procedural fetish means that before any agency can build anything, from a simple bike lane to a complex multi-billion-dollar project, it must tie itself down with mountains of procedure. Decision-makers know that lawsuits will challenge projects on procedural grounds, arguing that environmental impacts weren't studied thoroughly enough, or that public comment wasn't sufficiently inclusive. The result is a self-imposed paralysis, where exhaustive research and review yield little actual construction. This dysfunction doesn't affect all Americans equally. The lawyerly society functions as a servant of the wealthy. Lawyers help affluent homeowners block necessary housing construction, often citing environmental concerns and a cruel irony of how corrective measures became catastrophic constraints. New York City barely extends its mass transit system, but developers still build luxury high-rises for the wealthy. California struggles with wildfire response, but the rich can afford private firefighting services. It is working people who suffer most from the failure to build, who endure dilapidated public transit, who desperately need the new construction that never arrives. The Chinese engineering state, for all its construction prowess, operates without the constraints of meaningful citizen input. This enables both its impressive speed and its profound human costs. The zero-COVID policy demonstrated how the drive to hit numerical targets led to the traumatic Shanghai lockdown, a situation only possible in a system unbounded by public accountability. The one-child policy revealed how treating population management, like missile trajectories, produced forced sterilizations and abortions, creating more social pain than perhaps any other policy of the last half-century. Yet in 2025, as both nations navigate an increasingly competitive global landscape, the question is not which system is morally superior, but which can adapt to meet the challenges ahead. Climate change demands rapid decarbonization and massive infrastructure transformation. Geopolitical tensions require industrial capacity and supply chain resilience. Both challenges favor the nation that can build quickly and at scale. China's advantage in this domain is undeniable. In 2023 alone, China built 2/3 of the world's wind and solar plants. When America attempts similar projects, they encounter obstacles that would seem comical if they weren't so consequential. The Cape Wind Project, the first effort to develop offshore wind energy in the United States, was abandoned after 16 years of lawsuits, primarily from wealthy, predominantly liberal residents who opposed wind turbines disturbing their ocean views. The Biden administration poured enormous funds into green transition, but the pace of actual construction remains painfully slow. Money allocated is not infrastructure built. Announcements are not outcomes. The procedural gauntlet remains, and each renewable energy project must run it. If conflict were to emerge between these superpowers, the infrastructure divergence would manifest in stark military terms. American munition stockpiles would deplete rapidly while factories struggle to scale production through layers of regulation and approval. China, having maintained and expanded its industrial base, could rapidly increase output of drones, missiles, and military hardware, just as it scaled personal protective equipment production during the pandemic. Algorithms and artificial intelligence cannot win battles without the hardware to deploy them. The American advantage lies elsewhere, in robust democratic institutions, technological innovation, entrepreneurial dynamism, and a network of global alliances. These are formidable strengths that should not be discounted. But they cannot compensate indefinitely for the inability to build physical infrastructure at competitive speed and cost. A nation that cannot construct a high-speed rail line in less than 2 decades, that cannot expand subway systems in its largest cities, that cannot build offshore wind farms without decades of litigation, is a nation that has lost touch with a fundamental requirement of national power. The solution does not require emulating Chinese authoritarianism or abandoning environmental protections and public input. It requires recognizing that the pendulum has swung too far toward process and away from outcomes. America can look to its own history for inspiration, to the era of Robert Moses and the interstate highway system, when ambitious public works were conceived and executed within reasonable time frames. Those projects had flaws and externalities, but they were completed, and they formed the backbone of American prosperity for generations. The path forward demands conscious unwinding of the procedural fetish. It requires reducing the dominance of lawyers in governance and elevating engineers, economists, and other voices focused on delivery rather than obstruction. It means accepting that some projects will have imperfections rather than insisting on impossible standards that guarantee nothing gets built. It means trusting that society can flourish without empowering lawyers to micromanage every detail of every project. The public must decide whether it prefers a government that accomplishes tangible improvements to daily life, or one that is merely exquisite about process. The choice is not between Chinese autocracy and American democracy. It is between an America that builds and an America that deliberates endlessly. Between an America that lays track and pours concrete, and an America that files lawsuits and commissions studies. The $1.1 trillion that China will invest in infrastructure by 2030 is not just a number. It represents millions of workers employed, cities connected by high-speed rail, renewable energy capacity deployed at scale, and a government that maintains legitimacy through tangible improvements to citizens' lives. The $568 billion America has allocated through its Infrastructure Act is also not just a number. But its impact will be diluted by procedural delays, cost overruns, and the structural impediments of a lawyerly society. The divergence between these two superpowers in their capacity to build will shape the 21st century more than any other single factor. Military strength rests on industrial capacity. Economic competitiveness depends on modern infrastructure. Climate change demands rapid construction of renewable energy systems. Citizen satisfaction requires governments that can improve material conditions of life. China has demonstrated it can build at speed and scale. The question for America is whether it can remember how to do the same without abandoning its democratic values. The answer will determine not just which nation prevails in geopolitical competition, but which model of governance proves viable in an era that demands rapid, large-scale construction as a condition of national survival and prosperity. The engineering state builds with the risk of overreach and authoritarianism. The lawyerly society deliberates with the risk of paralysis and irrelevance. Between these poles lies a path that combines democratic accountability with the capacity for decisive action. Finding that path is the paramount challenge facing American governance in 2025 and beyond. The numbers from China's infrastructure push make clear that time is running out for America to rediscover its ability to build.